The murder of the Romanovs, Russia's ruling family. Once the subject of a high-stakes murder investigation, the trail went cold over 50 years of Soviet rule. Now, the mysterious deaths are fueling a heated battle.
They were executed in a basement, buried in secret, forgotten for decades. But what if the story we've been told isn't the whole truth? Deep in the Tsar's DNA, scientists found something impossible: 2 sequences where there should have been one. Could this tiny genetic anomaly finally silence the skeptics and confirm the fate of Russia's last royal family? This is the story of a dynasty destroyed, a mystery buried, and a single code that holds the truth. The Romanovs' last night. By the winter of 1917, 300 years of Romanov rule were collapsing under the weight of a war that Russia could not win, and a population it could no longer feed.
World War I brought Russia to revolution. In 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown.
Tsar Nicholas II had assumed personal command of the Russian army in September 1915, a decision that tied military failure directly to the crown. The Eastern Front consumed men at a rate that stunned even commanders accustomed to industrial-scale casualties. Behind the lines, food shortages in Petrograd and Moscow were generating the kind of civilian desperation that no autocracy can survive. Bread queues stretched for blocks, coal deliveries failed, workers struck, soldiers mutinied, and at the center of it all sat a Tsar who, by the accounts of virtually everyone around him, did not fully grasp the scale of what was unraveling. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas abdicated, not in the Winter Palace, not surrounded by courtiers. In a railway carriage at the Pskov station, in the presence of 2 Duma representatives, he signed a document renouncing the throne on behalf of himself and his hemophiliac son, Alexei. The 3-century Romanov dynasty ended with a signature on a piece of paper in a stationary train. What followed was a slow constriction. The provisional government placed the imperial family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. When the political situation in Petrograd grew unstable, they were moved east to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town chosen precisely for its isolation. For months, the family lived in a form of suspended limbo, confined but not mistreated, guarded but not yet condemned. Nicholas read. Alexandra prayed. The children put on amateur plays. Their world shrank, room by room, month by month. Then the Bolsheviks consolidated power, and the logic of the revolution shifted from containment to elimination. In April 1918, the family was transferred under armed escort to Yekaterinburg, an industrial city in the Ural Mountains controlled by hard-line Bolshevik commissars. They were installed in a requisitioned merchant's house belonging to a military engineer named Nikolai Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks gave it a name that has survived in every history written since: the House of Special Purpose. The windows were whitewashed. A tall wooden palisade was erected around the property. Guards were posted at every entrance. The family was confined to a handful of rooms on the upper floor. Their personal items were searched and confiscated in stages. Walks in the garden were limited, then eliminated. Contact with the outside world was severed entirely. The Romanovs had become prisoners in the most complete sense, and the men guarding them had already been told in broad terms how this would end. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was awakened shortly after midnight and told to dress and proceed to the basement. They were informed that the city was under threat from advancing White Army forces and that they needed to be moved to a safer location. Nicholas carried his son Alexei, who was too weak to walk unaided. Alexandra asked for chairs. 2 were brought. She sat in one. Alexei was placed in the other. The 4 Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, stood behind their parents. The family physician, Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, and 3 household servants, the valet Alexei Trup, the cook Ivan Karitonov, and the maid Anna Demidova, stood with them. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the House of Special Purpose, entered the room with a squad of armed men. He read a brief statement informing Nicholas that the Ural Soviet had ordered his execution. Nicholas turned to his family. He had time to say one word. Some witnesses recalled it as a question, others as a name. Then the shooting began. It was not swift. The basement room was small, roughly 25 square meters, and the firing squad of approximately 11 men discharged their weapons in an enclosed space filled with smoke and ricocheting bullets. Several of the Grand Duchesses did not fall. The bullets struck them and deflected. In the chaos, the executioners did not immediately understand why. The girls had sewn diamonds and precious stones into their corsets, layers of gems stitched into the fabric as a desperate last resort store of wealth. The stones acted as crude body armor. Bullets flattened against them or veered sideways. The room filled with gunpowder smoke so dense the men could barely see. Screaming continued. Yurovsky ordered a ceasefire and opened the doors to let the smoke clear. When visibility returned, several victims were still alive. The execution was finished with bayonets and point-blank pistol shots. The entire process, from the first volley to the last breath, lasted approximately 20 minutes. What was meant to be an efficient political elimination spiraled into butchery, and the horror was far from over. Erasing the Romanovs. The gunfire in the basement of the Ipatiev house ended around 2:30 on the morning of July 17, 1918. 11 bodies lay in the small, smoke-filled room. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant who had organized the execution, now faced a logistical nightmare. A hostile city, an advancing White Army, and an unambiguous directive from Moscow. No identifiable remains were to survive. The killing had been sanctioned, but the disappearance, the erasure, was yet to be completed. The bodies were wrapped in stripped bedsheets and carried to the courtyard, where a waiting Fiat truck idled with its engine running. Blood soaked through the fabric. The Grand Duchesses proved unexpectedly heavy. Diamonds, rubies, and gold, stitched into their undergarments, acted as crude armor. The truck struggled under the load of 11 corpses and containers of sulfuric acid and gasoline requisitioned that day from a local military depot on Yurovsky's orders. Their first destination was the Ganina Yama complex, a cluster of abandoned mines 14 kilometers north of Yekaterinburg. Yurovsky had chosen the Four Brothers shaft, shallow and partially flooded, hoping it would conceal the bodies. But it was inadequate, 7 meters deep, and the shaft could not fully submerge the corpses. When local peasants noticed unusual activity, Yurovsky realized the site was compromised. Attempts to collapse the shaft with grenades failed. He posted guards and awaited instructions from the Ural Soviet. Pyotr Voykov, the regional commissar who had supplied the acid and gasoline, arrived that evening. Together, they made a fateful decision. The bodies had to be moved deeper into the forest. Over the early hours of July 19th, the remains were hauled back onto the truck, decomposed, swollen, and charred from 36 hours in water and sun. Soldiers stripped the bodies, recovering over 8 kilograms of jewelry. The truck became mired in mud 4.5 kilometers from the mine. Exhausted and facing a stalled vehicle, Yurovsky made a decision that would echo through history. 2 of the bodies, the Tsarevich Alexei and 1 Grand Duchess, would be separated. Carried 70 meters to a small clearing, they were placed on a bonfire, doused in gasoline and burned for hours. Sulfuric acid was poured over the remnants, a shallow pit dug, and the fragments buried. The remaining 9 bodies were buried beneath the logging road. Acid was poured over faces and exposed skin. Railway sleepers were laid across the top. Earth was compacted and driven over to erase any trace. Branches and debris scattered. The separation was deliberate. Alexei, as heir, represented a symbolic threat. A complete grave could become a rallying point for monarchists. By fragmenting the burial, Yurovsky aimed to ensure the dynasty remained broken. Within a week, the White Army and Czechoslovak Legion entered Yekaterinburg. Investigator Nikolai Sokolov reached the Four Brothers shaft and found disturbed remains. Bone fragments, a severed finger, Dr. Botkin's glasses, belt buckles, and small personal items. But the main burial beneath the logging road remained hidden. Sokolov concluded that fire and acid had destroyed the bodies entirely. His report, published in exile in 1924, became the accepted account. For decades, the world believed the Romanovs were gone, nothing remaining, the Bolsheviks' objective complete. Yet beneath the muddy forest track, 9 skeletons lay in silence. 70 meters away, 44 charred fragments of a boy and his sister waited. Over them, birch trees grew, seasons turned, and the Soviet state wove a mythology of erasure. History assumed the dynasty had been obliterated, but the forest, the bones, and the rare signature written into DNA held a truth no fire, acid, or ideology could fully destroy. Shadows of Yekaterinburg. The man who found them was not an archaeologist, he was a geologist. Alexander Avdonin had been quietly researching the Romanov burial since the 1960s, working with a filmmaker named Geli Ryabov, who had obtained access to Yurovsky's handwritten account of the disposal. The account, held in Soviet state archives and shared with Ryabov through a series of politically delicate contacts, described the burial location in enough detail to narrow the search to a specific stretch of the Koptyaki Road. In 1979, Avdonin and Ryabov located the grave. They excavated quietly, without official permission, and recovered 3 skulls before reburying them out of fear. The Soviet government under Brezhnev was not a regime that welcomed the resurrection of murdered Tsars. Avdonin kept his knowledge secret for over a decade. It was not until July 1991, with the Soviet Union in its final months of existence, that a formal exhumation was authorized. A team led by forensic investigator Nikolai Sokolov, not to be confused with the White Army investigator of the same surname from 1918, excavated the main grave and recovered approximately 900 bone fragments and 9 largely complete skeletons. 9, not 11. 2 bodies were missing. The skeletal remains were subjected to the most comprehensive forensic analysis available at the time. Physical anthropologists determined the sex, approximate age, and stature of each skeleton. The configuration matched the known composition of the group killed in the Ipatiev house: a middle-aged male, a middle-aged female, 3 younger females, and 4 additional individuals consistent with the household staff. But 2 of the children were absent. The youngest daughter and the 13-year-old heir, Alexei, were not in the grave. This absence ignited a firestorm that had been smoldering for 70 years. Since the 1920s, a succession of individuals had come forward claiming to be surviving Romanov children. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a woman who surfaced in Berlin in 1920 and spent the rest of her life insisting she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia. Her claim attracted believers across Europe and America. Lawsuits were filed. Books were written. A 1956 film starring Ingrid Bergman cemented the Anastasia survival myth in popular culture. With 2 skeletons missing from the 1991 grave, the survival theories appeared to gain a foothold. If the bodies were not all accounted for, how could anyone be certain that none of the children had escaped? DNA promised an answer. In 1994, Peter Gill and colleagues at the British Forensic Science Service published the results of mitochondrial DNA testing on the Yekaterinburg remains. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively through the maternal line, was compared against samples provided by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who shared a direct maternal lineage with Tsarina Alexandra through her grandmother, Queen Victoria. The match was strong. The female skeletons carried mitochondrial sequences consistent with the Romanov maternal line. But the male skeleton identified as Nicholas presented a complication. His mitochondrial DNA showed heteroplasmy, the presence of 2 slightly different mitochondrial sequences within the same individual. The reference sample, taken from a known Romanov maternal relative, showed only one of those sequences. The match was not clean. And in forensic genetics in the mid-1990s, heteroplasmy was poorly understood and exceedingly rare in case databases. Anna Anderson's claim, at least, could be resolved. Tissue samples preserved from a surgical procedure she had undergone before her death in 1984 were tested independently by 2 laboratories. Her mitochondrial DNA did not match the Romanov maternal line. It matched instead a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, whom investigators had suspected for decades. Anderson was not Anastasia. The most famous Romanov survival claim collapsed under the weight of molecular evidence. But the heteroplasmy in Nicholas remained unexplained. And with 2 bodies still missing, the case was not closed. Not quite. The DNA anomaly. To understand why heteroplasmy mattered so much, you need to understand what mitochondrial DNA is and how it behaves. Every human cell contains 2 types of DNA. Nuclear DNA, the double helix in the cell's nucleus, carries the vast majority of our genetic information and is inherited from both parents. Mitochondrial DNA, a much smaller circular genome housed inside the mitochondria, the cell's energy-producing organelles, is inherited exclusively from the mother. It does not recombine, it does not shuffle. It passes intact, or nearly so, from mother to child, on generation after generation, making it an extraordinarily powerful tool for tracing maternal lineage across centuries. In the overwhelming majority of people, every mitochondrion in every cell carries an identical copy of the mitochondrial genome. One person, one sequence. This uniformity is what makes forensic matching straightforward. You compare the sequence from an unknown sample to a reference sample from a known maternal relative. If they match, the individuals share a maternal line. Nicholas II's remains broke this pattern. His mitochondrial DNA contained a mixture.
Mitochondrial DNA for samples that are very difficult to analyze. So for a crime scene, for example, you have
Most copies carried one sequence, but a minority carried a variant that differed by a single nucleotide at position 16,169. This condition, heteroplasmy, occurs when a mutation arises in one mitochondrion and is passed along to some but not all descendant mitochondria within the body. It is not an error, it is not contamination, it is a real, measurable biological phenomenon. But in the early 1990s, it had rarely been encountered in forensic casework, and its implications for identification were poorly mapped. The problem was statistical. The reference sample from Countess Xenia Sheremetev-Sfiri, a known maternal relative of Nicholas, showed only the majority sequence, not the variant. This meant the match was partial. One sequence aligned perfectly, the other was unaccounted for. For skeptics, this was enough to question the entire identification. If the DNA did not match cleanly, how could anyone be certain these bones belonged to the Tsar? In 1995, the Russian government authorized the exhumation of Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke Georgy Alexandrovich, who had died of tuberculosis in 1899 and was buried in the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. Georgy shared the same mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, and therefore the same mitochondrial lineage. When his mitochondrial DNA was sequenced, it displayed the identical heteroplasmy, the same position, the same mixture, the same rare variant present in a minority of copies alongside the dominant sequence. The statistical landscape shifted decisively. Heteroplasmy at this specific nucleotide position was not a random occurrence. It was a heritable familial trait, passed from Maria Feodorovna to both her sons. The odds of two unrelated individuals displaying heteroplasmy at the same position, with the same variant ratio, astronomically small. The anomaly was not noise, it was a signal. A genetic fingerprint so rare it functioned as a signature of the Romanov maternal line itself. The very detail that had fueled doubt became the strongest single piece of evidence in the identification. No imposter could have faked it, no contamination could have produced it, no coincidence could explain it. The heteroplasmy did not weaken the case, it locked it shut. But the case was still incomplete, two skeletons were missing. And until they were found, the question of whether all 7 Romanovs had died in that basement could not be answered with absolute finality. Alexei found. In the summer of 2007, a group of amateur archaeologists led by Sergei Plotnikov, working from a re-examination of Yurovsky's written account, I located a second burial site approximately 70 meters from the main grave on the Koptyaki Road. What they found was barely recognizable as human remains. 44 bone fragments, none larger than a few centimeters, severely damaged by fire and chemical degradation. Yurovsky's account had described pouring sulfuric acid over 2 bodies and burning them with gasoline. The physical evidence was consistent. These fragments had been subjected to extreme heat and corrosive chemicals. Several were charred black, some had partially calcified from acid exposure. A number of teeth and tooth fragments were recovered alongside the bones. The fragments were transported to multiple independent laboratories for analysis. The challenge was formidable. DNA degrades rapidly under heat and acid conditions. extracting usable genetic material from bones that had been burned in a forest pit 90 years ago and then saturated with sulfuric acid, was at the outer limit of what forensic genetics could accomplish. The laboratories succeeded. Using advanced extraction protocols and amplification techniques refined since the original 1994 analysis, researchers recovered both mitochondrial and nuclear DNA from the fragments. The mitochondrial DNA of one set of fragments matched the Romanov maternal lineage, consistent with the profile of Tsarina Alexandra. Nuclear DNA analysis, specifically short tandem repeat profiling, confirmed a parent-child relationship between these fragments and the skeletons already identified from the main grave. The second set of fragments yielded mitochondrial DNA that matched the maternal line of Nicholas II. And there, embedded in the sequence data, was the heteroplasmy. The same position, the same variant, the same rare mixture that had been found in Nicholas and in his brother Georgi. The fragments belonged to Alexei. The trait that had once threatened to undermine the identification had now completed it. Father and son, buried in separate graves, 70 meters and 90 years apart, linked by a mitochondrial anomaly so rare that its presence in both samples constituted proof beyond any reasonable statistical doubt. Independent confirmations came from laboratories in the United States, Austria, and Russia. The results were published in peer-reviewed journals, including a landmark 2009 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the age and sex profiles of the fragments matched the expected identities: a teenage male and an adolescent or young adult female. The female was confirmed through nuclear DNA to be a daughter of Nicholas and Alexandra. Ongoing debate about whether she was Maria or Anastasia has not been definitively settled by DNA alone, as the two sisters were close in age and the fragments are too degraded for certain morphological analysis. But the identities of the parents and the son are beyond dispute. All 7 members of the Romanov imperial family had been accounted for. All were dead. None had survived. The myths that had sustained decades of pretenders, from Anna Anderson to a dozen lesser claimants, were over. Not disproven by argument, not refuted by testimony, closed by molecular evidence that no narrative could override. The Bolsheviks had separated the heir from his family, burned his body, dissolved his bones in acid, and buried what remained in an unmarked pit in a Russian forest. They had done everything within their power to ensure that Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov would never be found. But they could not burn a nucleotide at position 16,169. And 89 years later, it spelled his name. The executioners believed they had finished the Romanovs. They could not have imagined that a secret written in molecules would outlive their bullets, their fire, and their lies. Bones speak where witnesses fall silent, and DNA tells stories that no ideology can erase. But if one dynasty could be hidden in plain sight for a century, what other truths remain buried, waiting for science, chance, or curiosity to uncover them?